When the credits roll on Deathloop, there are two ways to look at the game afterwards, as an experience to recall or as an art piece under scrutiny. To me, this is the delineation between a review and a critique. A review aims to capture the experience of a game, while a critique holds that game under further examination. I also think a review is best for the consumer and a critique is best for the developer. As a consumer, you're probably less inclined to be interested in a pretentious preamble, so without further...
I'm a drinker, occasionally a drunk, man about island. Everyone knows me, everyone hates me, handy with a gun, quick with a joke, I dress well, and why the fuck is everyone wearing a mask?
You forgot to mention your little hackama thingy? You'll get there.
It's a hackama jig. I'm done playing this your way. It's the cult show from now on.
Okay, all aboard, sweetie. Choo-choo.
I said cult show, not cult. Fuck it. Next stop, security office. Choo-choo.
One of the first things you'll notice about Deathloop is how much personality exists in the game. From the art style to the game world to the sound design to the characters and their voice acting. All of it is impeccable in establishing the personality of Deathloop. In many ways, Deathloop seems unable to identify what game it wants to be, but if there's one thing it's sure of, it knows what tone it wants to have. Deathloop is a quippy, stylized game trying to mimic the tone of a Marvel movie turned up to 11 like in Guardians of the Galaxy. Whether or not this appeals to you is completely subjective, but I personally thought the execution here was wonderful. The dialogue between Colt and Juliana is one of the best I've seen in a video game, rivaling only Portal, which is just a one-way conversation. Unfortunately, that doesn't hold up as the game goes on, because unlike Portal, it doesn't have a good twist at the ending. It does have a twist, but it falls under the terrible umbrella of contrived and retroactively tainting. Without giving it away, it has a twist to a similar Groundhogian video game that came out recently. But suffice to say, the character and personality doesn't hold up as far as the plot goes, but luckily, it is carried out through every level, every piece of dialogue, and every piece of writing. The personality is there, and you can see it, and it stays that way till the end of the game. If this is enough to get you to play it, then it might be worth it for you. The tone may be obvious upon first glance, but what may not occur to you is how much this game is a culmination of everything Arkane Studios has made so far. Even their collaboration on Wolfenstein Youngblood. From Youngblood, the developers brought along the punchy grit of weapon sound design and the satisfying gunplay. It's nothing remarkable, but considering this is Arkane's first attempt at a full shooter, it's a surprising success. From there, the most obvious inspiration is Dishonored, even directly pulling many mechanics from the game including Blink and Domino, as well as less obvious mechanics like the movement. The first Dishonored had pretty standard movement, but the sequel brought along sleek animations and slick parkour. It's hard to explain visually, but there's something extremely satisfying about running around in Dishonored 2, and that quality is not lost in Deathloop. Half the reason I never gave up on this game is because I found it endlessly enjoyable to double jump and blink around the map in my quest for MacGuffins. Which brings us to the main loop of Deathloop. Although Arkane Studios lifted many great mechanics from their back catalog, they also carried along some troublesome design methodologies. As much as I love Prey for its world design and level design, the act of progressing the plot was pretty tedious by the end. Arkane games have always included an excess amount of diaries, audio logs, and memoirs, but up until Prey, the engagement with this material was completely optional. But in Prey and in Deathloop, following these breadcrumbs are the main objective. So when I came into Deathloop and saw I'd have to read again and again and again, this is where I started to devolve into critiquing Deathloop more than reviewing it, so I'm gonna One of the first things you'll notice about Deathloop is that Juliana is your One of the first things you'll have heard about Deathloop is that death and loop. These are the core concepts of the game, which is why it's such a shame that they both end up being disappointing. In the first area of Updam, there are two NPCs mining away at a wall. If you kill them, the wall never crumbles and you won't be able to travel through their getaway overnight. On first impression, this seems exciting because it seems as though the entire game is going to have stuff like this, where events ripple into the next time of day and it's going to have an effect on your gameplay. But that hole they end up digging has pretty much no purpose. If you come back at night having spared them, you could just as easily hop over the gate. You don't even need blink, you just double jump. Even if this situation is lackluster, it gives you the impression that who you kill matters. But that's not true. I slaughtered all of the people of Updam multiple times, and each time the party still went on. I mean, it seems in line that the people of Updam would still party even after a brutal massacre, but who is alive to party? It wasn't hyperbole when I said I killed everyone in Updam. Looking at the map of the game, there aren't any other areas for people to be inhabiting, so where did they come from? The people at the complex are slaughtered by Igor, I killed everyone at Frystal Rock, and the people of Carlsbad are having their own party. And then when you disable Igor's device, I thought it would matter whether or not you're trying to hide your tracks, but it actually doesn't. One of the first things you'll have seen about Deathloop is the marketing of the multiplayer. For me and my friends, it was a big part of the draw for the game. We were going to invade each other and mess each other's loops up. Unfortunately, the reality of this idea was far from the fantasy advertised in the promotional material. When on the main menu of the game, you have the choice of playing as Colt or Juliana. Juliana has no narrative whatsoever, so the only gameplay is invading Colt's timeline. Unless you want to ruin some other random player's loop, which is quite punishing in the early game, you're more likely to just play as Colt's storyline. Once you start playing, there's no way to pause a mission and invade another player. You need to either restart the whole mission or complete it before invading. I understand the reasoning here, you don't want people to be leaving it while they're invaded, but this could have easily been solved with a simple Boolean value. Is the player being invaded? If not, let them pause and go invade. If yes, don't let them leave. Anyway, because of this issue, me and my friends rarely ever invaded each other. Altogether, the multiplayer feature feels tacked on, which is disappointing considering it was heavily marketed as the main draw of the game. Even more, it wasn't tacked on, it was a core part of the game's development, but the multiplayer aspect of the game feels so poorly implemented and its inclusion detracts from the game in many ways. Presumably the only reason Cult is limited to 2 slabs, 3 weapons, and 4 character charms is that the developers didn't want Cult being too overpowered against an invading Juliana. This attempt at balance fails to be enough for the multiplayer and impedes on the single player experience. Since the player can't have all the slabs at once, the developers don't design areas with specific slabs in mind. The irony here is that a player could easily come back to an area with the proper slab if a certain one was required for some obstacle. The only instance where I found this to be true was in Charlie's Moxie side objective. Here, the Blink and Invid slabs will get you through the gauntlet in a breeze. Since you're unlikely to have them both equipped, you'll have to come back here on the next loop. An argument against this could be that it forces the player to replay a loop, but many of the main objectives do that for far less motivated reasons. Almost every time you acquire a new plot thread, you're required to restart the loop to move on to the next piece. But I'm digressing from the topic at hand. One of the first things you'll notice about Deathloop is that... Are you getting annoyed by this gimmick yet? It might have been interesting the first or second time I did this in the video here, but it's probably dragging on at this point. Hopefully that gives you the impression of what it's like to play this game 17 hours in. I said at first my intention was to do a review. My hope is that I've given you the feeling of what it's like to be following rambly breadcrumbs that don't really lead anywhere and don't have much payoff. In a way, I've used my own inability to write a script as a way to show how it feels to play Deathloop. If you've gone through all of this and you're still entertained, then maybe this is the game for you. But I'm gonna stop with the scripted sequences and just kind of go down a bullet list for the rest of the review. The AI is dumb, and it seems intentionally dumb because the AI in Dishonored was by no means genius, but it was certainly better than this. My impression is that AI is dumb as a way to make stealth easier, and to encourage people to use stealth when they otherwise would not. Because the reality is, you don't really need to use stealth in this game. There's also less options for stealth. In Dishonored, you have a lot of ways to be stealthy. In this game, you really don't. There's a silenced pistol, nail gun, and a machete. Those are your only ways for stealth kills, so the game needed to have dumber AI to make stealth a viable option. Ultimately, I think it was a good decision, but as such, the AI is not a challenge at all. Going through the game, you can basically run through everything killing people. The only time you'll really have to face a challenge is the up-dem party at night, or when you get invaded. That's what makes the invasion so interesting because it completely flips the gameplay. You're going against these dumb AI that you can easily take out to an actual player, or even Juliana's AI, which is pretty good at times. She can put up a fight as much as a player can. Unfortunately though, the invasions rarely work. You have no reason to play as Juliana during the campaign, like there's no rewards, so most players will likely invade once they've beaten the game. And new players are more likely to spend more time in missions, so what you end up with is the best players who've beaten the game going against new players. That's not a good foundation for a player base, and I think I've talked about multiplayer enough, so I'll just go on to the next topic. The personality and the writing is the next thing I have. I've talked about this at the beginning, but I really do think it's outstanding in this game. All the way through, the writing is really good. The overall plot falls apart, but it's refreshing to see voice actors really giving everything to the role. There are many voice actors who just come from Hollywood and think of voice acting as a way to cash a quick check. It's obvious that the voice actors in this game, every voice actor, was putting a lot of effort into their character. And I think that's something worth mentioning again. The next thing I want to talk about I haven't touched on yet, it's that the abilities have no way to be countered. I think this could be seen as a flaw with all Arkane games, but up until now it didn't really matter too much that you couldn't be countered. For a counter example, in Dishonored you can be countered by Dowd when you fight him. If you use the slow time ability, he actually maintains speed with you. In Deathloop there's no features like this for Colt and Juliana. Perhaps it would have been too difficult to get a similar mechanic like that from Dishonored to have the time not stop for both players. But I think if they were going to make a multiplayer game, they should have created some way to counter different abilities. As it is now, you can just hit someone with Carnesis, you can just kick somebody, you can't stop someone from blinking, you can't stop any ability someone's going to use. You just have to deal with what they're doing. I will admit that comes down to personal taste. Not all games have counters like that, and it's not necessarily a requirement for Deathloop. It's just something I would have liked to see them experiment with in this game. All of their games have kind of centered around making you stronger and stronger. It would have been nice to see them try and make a way to counter the other player instead of just both of you being OP. The temporal contrast at each location is pretty good. There are only 4 locations in the game, but when I first started, I constantly thought I was at a new place because I didn't realize how much one area had changed. It's obvious the developers put a lot of effort into trying to make each area distinct at each time zone. And the distinction between each area is carried by the art direction, which is my next topic. Art direction in Arkane games are usually top-notch. Dishonored especially, the art direction in Dishonored, almost every scene could be a screenshot. All of their games have something to look at, and it's almost always a good art direction as well as level design. It's quite admirable how much Arkane are able to balance those two things, having an area be mechanically functional as well as artistically pleasing. Unfortunately, given to the game's fast pace, you don't always have time to appreciate it, which goes into my next one, atmosphere. There's a lot of good atmosphere here, as well as all of Arkane games. However, since this isn't stealth focused, you don't have as much time to pay attention to the atmosphere. As such, you're probably going to miss out on a lot of good moments that the game designers put in. Obviously, that's not your fault at all. The designers made this game less about stealth and more about running and shooting. Even so, they stuck to what they know and did the same design mentality as if it was a stealth game. Of course, this makes great atmosphere for the game, but unfortunately a lot of players aren't going to notice it. Speaking of ways that designers stop you from noticing their game, the objective markers completely stop you from paying attention to the main story. Coming from Prey, I was a bit exhausted by the idea that I would just be going through documents and audio files again, so the moment I saw that the game just shows you what the information is and kind of lays it all out for you, I immediately turned off my brain for the main objective. The objective markers for this game guide you through the main story so well that it stops being a puzzle. I can't tell you how I solved anything, I just know I followed the objective markers. I understand the sentiment, they don't want players to be stuck and they want to have a way for players to know what they're doing, but by having it on as default, they imply that this is the way the game is supposed to be played. I think for all Arkane games, they're designed well enough that you really don't need objective markers on. Something worth noting, while playing Prey, I was highly invested in all the side quests, though it's something Deathloop fails to do. It fails to catch my interest with the side quests. Part of this might boil down to the first 2 side quests I did, which had no payoff whatsoever. There's one side quest with a twisting chamber, and it's a really interesting puzzle. There's this twisting chamber, you need a battery for it. I got the battery, started going through, explored the whole area, and at the end of it there's this gate that's closed. From the gate, you can grab a shotgun through the window, but I figured I should open the gate first and see what's in there. I went through the whole area and found a way to get in, only to be rewarded with literally nothing. I understand to some extent you don't want to reward players for everything, some things are their own reward, but it was a pretty big letdown. Then the second objective I did was a gas chamber where there's a guy who ends up killing you if you don't know how to solve the puzzle. Once I did solve the puzzle on my second attempt, I was confused because there was nothing else left. Once you crack the code and complete the puzzle, he just says, "Ah, shucks, you got me. Well, you won't get me next time." And that's it, that's the end of it. That's all there is, and it made me uninterested in all the other side quests. Moving on from the side quests, one thing I want to touch on is the unintuitive and regressive controls. In all their previous games, they've had a weapon wheel, and I feel like that's a better choice than most games offer. I think the reason they decided to get rid of it was because you can't pause the game in Deathloop, so they didn't want a situation where someone pulls up the weapon wheel and they get killed because it's taking up their whole screen. However, the alternative they came up with misses the mark on being more utilitarian. It's just strange. Next bullet point I have here is split focus. I feel like they didn't really decide what kind of game they wanted to do, and because of that there's a split focus. It doesn't feel like they're doing anything in particular. They're doing a whole bunch of other things, and I'll get to later about how I think that pays off. The animations in this game are pretty good. I couldn't remember any animations that were bad. They were all pretty slick, pretty smooth. There's even a funny one where if you're running while you're reloading the nail gun, you just kind of chuck them in. Not even all of them make it in. My friend pointed that out to me, and I think it would have been really funny if some of the ammo didn't make it in the gun. Obviously that wouldn't be good as an actual mechanic, but regardless, all the animations are really good, and there's animations for things you wouldn't even expect there to be animations for. The weapon variety may not seem like much when you first start playing this game, but I actually think it was a good idea to have a limited inventory. Considering that you can only wield 2 weapons, it makes sense that you don't want to have a whole lot of options. In fact, I think they could have cut 2 weapons, the auto shotgun and the LMG. One is too overpowered and the other is too underpowered, but ultimately I think it's a good balance what they have. The sound design is pretty good too. I kind of already went over how good the weapons are. They have a good punch to them. They sound really good to use. Overall, the audio is done really well. There's different textures for when you're walking on things, different echoing when you're in certain areas. Basically all the fundamentals you'd expect from a AAA game, but I think it's worth mentioning even if it is to be expected. They did a really good job. One important topic that probably should have been stated earlier is the fact that this really isn't an immersive sim. It has all the same abilities, sure, but it doesn't have a lot of choice that comes into the game. For the most part, there's multiple ways to get to every area, but it never feels really meaningful. Basically, it's whether you want to go in loud or quiet. Overall, the level design is pretty good, but it suffers from the feeling that none of it is inspired. Everything feels like they already know how to do it, but they know how to do it well. So even if it is uninspired, all the level design is pretty solid. With that being said, there's not much choice in this game. There's only one way to kill all 8 visionaries, and it's laid out for you. Overall, if you were to evaluate this game as an immersive sim, I would say it's very light on actually being one. My next point is the removal of manual saves, and I think this makes the whole game worth it. Even if Deathloop was a complete failure, which I don't think it is, I would at least be happy to know that some people are trying to experiment with what you can do with saves. Having the saves as it is, it creates a lot of tension from risk aversion. It's a feeling rarely explored in video games, and I'd like to see more approaches on the idea, more than just doing a roguelike. Deathloop is kind of doing something different, but I'm really hopeful to see more experimentation like this. That being said, this game is constantly pulling you out of the experience, which contrasts with the design intention of contextualizing death. You're only ever fast traveling between locations, you're constantly looking at menus. Of all Arkane games, this is certainly the least immersive. I mentioned briefly in that the areas are too small. I'm not sure it's that they're too small, but that traversal is too easy. By the end of the game, you can see me zipping around every area. I don't think this actually comes on the areas being too small. I mean, I think there's enough content in this game. I think today developers are too quick to put too much into their game, and I'm happy Deathloop is what it is. I'm glad they didn't overshoot and try to get even more areas into the game. That being said, I think they should have tuned down on how fast you can travel between the areas. As it is now, you can get in and out of a mission very quickly without any real care of where you're going. Considering you're supposed to get invaded while this is happening, it's not a good setup for a multiplayer game. I touched on this in the beginning, but Deathloop is ultimately a culmination of everything Arkane has done before, and that's not exactly a good thing. In some respect, it's cool to see them harkening back to their older titles, but it's Dishonored with the abilities, stealth, and movement, but all of it feels stripped back. The choices aren't as meaningful, the AI is dumbed down making stealth even easier, and the abilities aren't as abundant and you can't use them all at once. They also fail to do anything interesting with the mechanics to take from Dishonored, and they aren't able to capture the same atmosphere that Dishonored was able to. From Prey, they try to take the mystery and narrative, but it's not as novel at this point and they don't do it as well. Arx Fatalis, they take the kick. And from Wolfenstein, they don't manage to make as good of a shooter as Wolfenstein. Deathloop feels like all these titles but stripped back. Dishonored but stripped back. Prey but stripped back. Deathloop being a culmination of everything but not doing any of it as well, the only saving grace would have been to pull it all together into something greater than the sum of its parts. While it never really reaches that standard, it seems proud to simply be style over substance. When the credits roll on Deathloop, I'm left wondering if it's a game I'll ever revisit again. I certainly had a great time playing Deathloop, but it just doesn't feel as iconic as Arkane's previous work. The theme of Deathloop was a fear of breaking routine, letting go of what you have and the risk of losing it all. As Arkane pushes further into the mainstream and grows larger, they'll be faced with the hard decision to stick with what they know or risk their reputation on an experimental title. It's nice to see them strike out on something new, and I hope with their next title they'll venture out even further. If this was their first attempt at breaking out of the loop, I'm excited to see what they try next time.
Face to face with the gun.
Hopefully with a different engine.